It has been nearly 50 years since the last human being set foot upon the lunar surface. Were budget constraints really the driving force behind this decision, or was it something far more sinister? If the accounts of certain whistleblowers are to be believed, then it might just be that there is something on the moon. History tells us that between 1969 and 1972, American astronauts completed a total of 6 successful landings on the surface of the moon. The last of these missions, Apollo 17, concluded on December 19, 1972, when Eugene Cernan, Schmitt and Ronald Evans were recovered from the Pacific Ocean by the crew of the USS Ticonderoga. But despite a further 3 Apollo missions having been planned to follow on from this, no other manned expedition from any nation has since taken place. The official justification behind this sudden reversal in NASA's lunar exploration program was a shift in both the financial and political landscapes. At the height of the Cold War, America's victory in the space race, being the first major power to achieve a successful manned landing, provided Richard Nixon with the prestige and propaganda he needed over his Soviet rivals. But the overall costs of the program had rocketed from an initial estimate of $7 billion to well over $20 billion, and this huge expenditure proved difficult to maintain. The technology available at the time only allowed for a period of mere hours on the moon's surface on each occasion. And with no natural resources or significant scientific material forthcoming from the first few trips, NASA found it impossible to secure the funding needed to carry out what remained of their program. With the landmark victory now achieved by the Western powers, Russia's passion for space exploration also cooled, and as subsequent missile treaties limited any further advancement in the field, dreams of a lunar colony were slowly relegated to the pages of science fiction. In the decades that followed, an intermittent stream of probes and robotic landers from nations such as India, China, and the USA have all been dispatched to different regions of our nearest heavenly body. The majority of these have ultimately ended up crashing into the lunar surface, either due to technical failure or after fulfilling their purpose. And yet despite all of these expeditions, we know little more about the moon than we did at the start of the 1970s. Throughout the years that have passed since the sudden conclusion of the Apollo program, there have been several reports that the crews involved encountered more than just rock and dust. Stories of strange tracks observed on the ground near landing zones, mysterious objects seen floating in the sky, and imposing alien structures glimpsed way off in the distance have all emerged. In some cases, these claims are supported by poor quality and grainy photographs. In others, audio files that have either been erased or edited are offered up as evidence of a conspiracy. Throughout all these stories, there is, however, a common thread: the moon may already be home to existing residents, inhabitants who do not appreciate unwanted intrusions. In 2015, an article began to circulate on Reddit, purporting to be from a British psychologist, who had viewed confidential reports divulging that further moon landings had taken place since Apollo 17, and detailing exactly what had happened to them. And whilst there are many aspects of this alleged testimony that are either impossible to verify, or comfortably easy to debunk, there are elements of it which commentators claim add credence to similar tales surrounding NASA's official landings. The anonymous source claimed that the astronauts of Apollo 17 had not traveled far from their landing site when they came across the shattered remains of another landing craft. In addition to the severely damaged vehicle itself were the bodies of a number of cosmonauts, all of which appeared to be Soviet in origin. But it was not the unexpected appearance of this debris field that most shocked the astronauts, more that all of the wounds and damage inflicted upon the victims seemed to have been caused by a physical assault of some kind, rather than any form of decompression or collision impact. The hull of the Russian spacecraft had been repeatedly torn and punctured by an unknown source, with the glass faceplates on the helmets of the dead cosmonauts all smashed in an identical fashion. The American crew had immediately returned to their lander and requested permission to lift off again, only to be told that they had to remain on the ground for several more hours due to technical issues. During this time they sent increasingly panicked radio transmissions, claiming they could see shadowy figures moving around on the hills outside, gradually making their way closer to the module. This psychologist detailed that there was a joint British and Russian mission to return to the crash site in 1989, and that he had been asked to assist with debriefing the crew of this expedition when it returned home. The Russian lander successfully arrived in the vicinity of Apollo 17's landing zone in December of 1990. Only for the crew to be attacked by unknown entities. This attack was watched in disbelief by their controllers at the Okhotsk launch site. Before all contact with them was lost, is the surface of the moon littered with the remains of previous landings, the existence of which has been covered up by the nations who secretly dispatched them there. There is evidence that Russia has yet to disclose the full extent of their endeavors in this direction. Personnel records of cosmonauts involved in the program were allegedly altered to hide the deaths of pilots involved in failed missions, and amateur radio enthusiasts claim to have monitored desperate transmissions from dying cosmonauts whose craft malfunctioned in orbit. Whilst orbiting the moon during May of 1969, Apollo 10 crew members Eugene Cernan and John Young reported that they could hear strange noises emanating from the surface below. This phenomenon consisted of an eerie whistling sound, which the two men described as outer space music. Their controllers were at a loss to explain what the astronauts were hearing, and it is only in later years that the incident has been attributed to feedback generated between VHF transmitters situated in different parts of their spacecraft. Another strange tale surfaced after the conclusion of the Apollo 15 mission in July of 1971. Transcripts of radio transmissions which took place whilst crew members David Scott and James Irwin were outside their lander reveal that they stumbled across what appeared to be vehicle tracks at the base of Mount Hadley. They described these impressions as linear, running from east to west, and totally uniform in nature. And yet, one of the most defining features of Apollo 15 is that it was the first expedition to be equipped with an experimental lunar rover. It is, however, the claims that the crew of the iconic Apollo 11 mission reported multiple sightings of unidentified spacecraft and structures on the moon that have most captured the imagination of conspiracy theorists. The first of these encounters was reported only 3 days into their mission, when Commander Neil Armstrong requested clarification of where the third stage of the mission's Saturn V rocket was in relation to the main vessel. After a 3-minute delay, he was informed that the jettison rocket housing should have been situated 6,000 miles behind the lunar module, which was still traveling away from Earth and towards the moon. Armstrong's subsequent reply to this information would create a ripple of confusion and uncertainty amongst the mission controllers. He had been notified by colleague Buzz Aldrin that something was traveling on a parallel course alongside their ship. Armstrong described the object as metallic, shaped like a cylinder, with what appeared to be a light source emanating from one end. After he had lost sight of the mysterious object, he had again asked NASA for clarification, and was informed it was possibly a loose piece of metal paneling, which may have been blown clear of the main booster. An even more disturbing radio conversation is believed to have taken place between Armstrong and the Houston Control Center in the immediate aftermath of his arrival on the moon. During a 2-minute period, where transmissions between the mission and its controllers had apparently failed, it is alleged that Armstrong had continued to transmit on a secondary radio channel, designed to monitor the health and welfare of the astronauts, although not heard by the general public. It is claimed that transcripts from this channel show that Armstrong reported he could see metallic objects at the edge of a nearby crater. He described buildings that led down under the moon's surface, and what appeared to be metallic vehicles parked up in lines outside these constructs. Although he supposedly took many pictures with his chest-mounted camera, these images have never been published. As he was ordered to withdraw to the lander, he was then asked if he had managed to deploy the scientific equipment he had been tasked with. He replied that he had, but was concerned that the occupants of the craft he had seen were observing him, and would easily remove the items he had just positioned. In the years since the Apollo 11 mission, a number of witnesses have come forward, claiming that when they had challenged Armstrong on the sighting in private, he had freely admitted it to them, on the grounds that they did not record the conversation. He is alleged to have expressed great apprehension and fear about the craft he encountered, believing that they were trying to actively warn humans away from any further exploration of the moon. The deaths of 2 prominent ufologists in October of 2018 have recently generated a great deal of speculation within the media. Although apparently unrelated, both men were former members of the United States military, and had risen to prominence on the basis of allegations they had made regarding NASA, and how it had concealed evidence of extraterrestrial life on the surface of the moon. Bob Dean had served as a sergeant major in the U.S. Army, and had spent the majority of the 1960s stationed at various military facilities on the European mainland. During this time, he claimed that NASA had secretly destroyed up to 40 rolls of film which had been shot by the astronauts of the Apollo 11 mission. So underhand were the tactics allegedly deployed by the space agency. Dean often joked that the acronym secretly stood for Never a Straight Answer. In addition to this claim, Dean also stated that during his time in the Army, he had read a top-secret dossier which evaluated the potential threat to humanity by extraterrestrial invaders. This document contained photographs of a number of downed alien spacecraft, and the findings from the autopsies which had later taken place on their pilots. Within a week of Dean's death at his home in Tucson on October 11, authorities in Lansing, New York were called to the scene of a fatal traffic accident. A 74-year-old cyclist named Carl Wolf had been crushed to death when he had been hit by a tractor. Not only was Wolf a former U.S. Air Force sergeant, but he was also a whistleblower who claimed to have seen terrifying evidence proving there were indeed aliens on the moon. In 1965, Wolf had been stationed at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, specializing as an electronics technician. His primary duty was the evaluation and repair of various photographic systems which had been deployed by the Air Force during the Vietnam conflict. But one day, he found himself temporarily reassigned to NASA's Lunar Orbiter project. Wolf described how he reported to a nondescript hangar on the far side of the base, which was largely occupied by scientists and translators dressed in civilian clothing. He was led to a room where he met another airman, who explained that NASA was having issues producing photographs from the most recent lunar mission, as one of their developing machines was malfunctioning. Having worked with his colleague to locate and rectify the fault, Wolf was amazed to see a series of images from what appeared to be the lunar landscape, complete with a whole city of mysterious alien structures. He described having seen towers, domes and mushroom-shaped buildings, all allegedly situated on the dark side of the moon. The NCO had been stunned by what he had witnessed, and had fully expected that he would be hearing about the discovery on the evening news. But as weeks turned into months, he eventually realized that the government had no intention of revealing the existence of the alien city to the world. In 2001, along with 20 other former servicemen and intelligence officials, he finally went public with his story. Certainly, many photographs sent back by probes in orbit around the moon show some interesting anomalies, with lights appearing in craters, and the apparent depiction of unnatural structures, some of which are several miles high. There are also those who assert that the moon may not even be a natural satellite at all. At least not in the most conventional sense. Some commentators believe that the surface of the moon is merely an external shell for something far more sinister, such as a space station or gigantic alien spacecraft. The claim is similar to that of the hollow Earth theory, whose supporters believe that there is a vast network of tunnels and caverns under the Earth's surface, which humanity is unaware of. As evidence of their claims, hollow moon theorists point to data produced by seismometers which were left on the moon's surface by each of the Apollo missions. Between 1972 and 1977, these instruments recorded a series of geological movements underneath the lunar landscape, all of which varied in scale and intensity. During the Apollo 12 mission, the decision was made to deliberately crash the ascent stage of the crew's lunar module back onto the surface. In the aftermath of this, monitoring stations back on Earth recorded a strange reverberation that continued for an hour. Apparently, the moon rang like a bell. For subscribers of the hollow moon theory, this is evidence of vibrations echoing around huge spaces, buried beneath a thin layer of rock and dust. We see. As we sift through the various stories that have emerged from the Apollo program, it is ostensible that there may well have been events and occurrences on the moon's surface which defy conventional explanation. In some of these cases, NASA has provided varying degrees of justification. In others, either by action or inaction, they have allowed evidence which might have assisted in divining the truth to be destroyed. In reality, the physical and mental stress produced during the lunar missions may be a factor and could have affected the psychology of those involved. In the large number of reported incidents, the experiences of the astronauts can easily be attributed to optical illusions and the unforeseen failure of the equipment and material they were utilizing, and yet, the public imagination continues to be captured by stories of sinister lunar residents. Perhaps there is indeed some truth behind the rumors. And in the decades to come, we will discover that we do indeed have celestial neighbors we were previously unaware of. And if that is the case, we can only hope they do not object to sharing this little corner of the galaxy with the human race.